And because of this particular acknowledgement of this particular risk, certain changes were made by the regulators. And as we speak, it is getting implemented in countries like India. India actually delayed this particular implementation for some more period because of COVID. Otherwise, April 2020 was a deadline to implement some of these measures that I'm going to talk about. Now they've actually extended the deadline because of the COVID crisis. But a lot of banks across the world has actually implemented these two measures as a measure of liquidity risk management. One is called a liquidity coverage ratio. Okay, this is important for you to understand because it's contemporary. If you're actually going for a bank interview, etc., you might actually encounter these questions. One is a liquidity coverage ratio. What is a liquidity coverage ratio? It's a ratio between high quality liquid assets divided by a net cash outflow in a 30-day period. So this net cash outflow in a 30-day period is a stress period. So the RBI has clearly mandated what construes as a net cash outflow. Suddenly there is a 30% vanishing of all your time deposits, all your current account, savings account. Okay, there is a certain percentage that will be sought out from your fixed deposits, even your demand deposits, even your time deposits. There will be a certain withdrawal in a stress period. If you actually are if you encounter a stress period where 100 rupees is sought from you, and if you are only maintaining 70 rupees worth of liquid assets, then you are in trouble. So what you have to maintain is a certain level of liquid assets, both cash and your SLR, okay, put together should actually encompass your net cash outflow in a 30-day period. So you're trying to ensure that the banks do maintain a certain level of liquid assets to facilitate any sudden outflow of liquidity that can come in a short span of time. Now, this particular ratio, Indian banks were well protected because India has something called as SLR, which is not very common in advanced economies. Okay, we had already banks parking roughly 19.5% of their entire deposits, net liabilities into assets which are extremely liquid in nature. So in that sense, this particular measure was not of a huge consequence for Indian banks. This is called the liquidity coverage ratio. This is trying to protect whether you are maintaining enough liquidity when there is a sudden withdrawal of liquidity from the market. Okay, the period considered is a high stress period that I already mentioned about. The second one is called the net stable funding ratio. It's called the net stable funding ratio, or the NSFR. What is this? This is actually talking about amount of stable funding. Now the numerator is from the liability side. Amount of stable funding is nothing but your capital, your deposits, and some form of debt. Okay, this comes true as the amount of stable funding. Okay, and in the denominator you have required amount of stable funding. What is required amount of stable funding? If it is cash, you don't need any required amount of stable funding because it's a liquid asset already. If you're actually having an illiquid asset on the asset side of the balance sheet, let's assume mortgage, then you have to finance that mortgage with some amount of stable funding, not unstable funding. So if you're actually going for mortgages, then don't finance it with CPs. Okay, because the tenor is a mismatch. It is not a stable source of funding for the asset that you are actually taking risk on. So based on the asset risk, again, it is risk weighted, like I explained in multiple classes. It is risk weighted, and based on the risk weights, each asset's required amount of stable funding is computed, and your amount of stable funding should be at least 100% more than the required amount of stable funding, or rather the ratio should be more than equal to 100%. Okay, so these two measures try to ensure that the banks or the financial institutions maintain a certain level of liquidity in their functioning. Now, what do you think happened for NBFCs? Did RBI mandate? Now, if these kind of ratios were already in place, why did NBFCs go through the tough times that they did in 2018-19? What do you think? Your DHFL, your DHIL, okay, sorry, HDIL, or your ILFS. If the RBI was already privy to all these measures which were mandated by Basel III, why did NBFCs go through the tough times in managing their liquidity? Did they have something like this mandated by RBI, where they actually regulated? What do you think? What do you think? Have you encountered these ratios, LCR and NSFR, or first time, hearing for the first time? Have you encountered these ratios? Is there any material impact of these ratios in the market, or is just a simple ratio, sir? I mean, fine liquidity. Is that the case, or is there any material impact of actually banks maintaining these ratios? NSFR for the first time. Okay. Yeah. So these two are actually after Basel III regulations. That's only after 2011. These ratios were mandated by the regulators, and India started implementing it in 2015. We are staggering it, but you know, the RBI has actually delayed the implementation because that will actually set back banks to put a lot of liquid assets in place, or rather go for stable funding. Now it is not the right time to do so, and hence they have delayed it. Do you think these are actually material, these changes? What happens? Some of these regulations. So one of the regulatory changes that got delayed by RBI, or rather RBI mandated to be delayed, was this capital conservation buffer. That actually released 56,000 crores in terms of capital for banks. How is stable funding defined? Stable funding is defined. So amount of stable funding is essentially some of the liability side items are construed as stable funding. Capital, okay, your entire equity capital and your reserves. Some part of your deposits, okay, are construed as stable funding. Some part of your liabilities, some of the long run perpetual bonds are considered as stable funding. So they are the numerator of this particular ratio. And required amount of stable funding, actually having an asset, say 100 rupees is given for a mortgage, then they say, look, they will have a risk weight of 100%, which means 100 rupees out of 100 rupees should be financed using stable source of funding, not unstable source of funding. So if you want to go for a mortgage, so ensure that you finance it through equity or through deposits or through long run perpetual bonds, not using commercial papers. You get the example? You get the do you get the example, Sesh? For a bank, the CASA deposits would be non-stable. Yeah, so CASA is non-stable. Only the time deposits are considered as stable. So they have given a certain percentage, okay, in terms of what construes as stable funding. So if you take a hypothetical bank balance sheet where I put 100 rupees, entire 100 rupees in mortgages, which is again for a long run, 30-year-old asset or 30-year tenor loan I've given, and I can finance it only using capital and stable source of funding. I cannot finance it using, say, CPs or through wholesale funding. Okay, that is not allowed today. So these are ways in which the banks have been ring fenced, okay, to ensure that liquidity kind of risk doesn't arise. So you would not really hear more and more of such instances where short term source of financing is used to finance long run assets. Those kind of risk will actually mitigate or actually come down because of these regulations that are in place, and this has been extended to NBFCs also, sadly only after the ILFS fiasco. Okay, now RBI has imbibed this particular regulations for NBFCs also, and hence they will also have to maintain a certain level of liquidity to avoid such stresses in their balance sheet also. Okay, and this is what the regulation says. Okay, yeah, and finally, I will just invoke this particular concept called liquidity black holes, just to pick your brains here. Okay, one thing to note is that when I talked about is market makers who are sitting in the middle and trying to provide liquidity to the market, the overall spreads have come down over a period of time. Why? Because of technology. Now it is much more faster, much more easier, that their cost of operations have come down. Okay, so the spread that they charge is a function of their cost of operations and also the risk that they're bearing. Because of technology, the overall cost of operation has come down for a lot of these market makers. Okay, so technology has reduced this, but also the sad part is the flip side is there could be some technology disruptions that I just mentioned about, like Zerodha. Okay, if there's such technological disruptions, you will have sudden movement or sudden vanishing of liquidity as against earlier. Okay, that is called liquidity black holes. There are multiple reasons why these liquidity black holes exist. Okay, there is a concept called positive and negative feedback traders. Have you heard about this? Positive and negative feedback traders. It's very, very prevalent in Indian market. Okay, positive and negative feedback traders, very, very prevalent in Indian market. What is that? Have you really thought about this kind of? I'll give you a hint. It is about FIIs and DIIs, foreign institutional investors and domestic institutional investors. Positive and negative feedback traders. It is very important that any good market has both these kind of traders. Why? Because when you have FIIs, what is FII strategy? They buy, okay, when the price are low, okay, and they sell when the price are high. Okay, that is usually their method. They will just come into the market and start purchasing the asset. They just take it to a high level and then they start selling. Now, what happens when FIIs sell? Mind you, what is the proportion of ownership of FIIs in the Indian market? Again, a trivia question. How much does FIIs hold of the large cap stocks in Indian market? How much of the volumes are driven by FIIs in Indian market? All, roughly 60 students. I am Kozhikode. PGP finance, or rather not PGP in risk management, okay, all finance, enthusiasts. What proportion of the entire volume traded in the Indian market is done by FIIs? Roughly, I'm just asking a rough estimate. Does it really matter to you? Does it really matter that FIIs are trading heavily in the market? Or institutional investors, how much do they hold? Yes, they do. How much do they own of the? So, what is the maximum that they own in firms? Let me ask you that. Roughly on an average, large cap firms, how much they can hold in a particular firm in India? FIIs, 49%. Seriously, large cap firms, 49%. They own only roughly 20% or 22%, okay, of the large cap firms. Now, what is the sad part about that, or rather the interesting part about that is they own 22, 23%, but 50% of the ownership is held by promoters. They are not traded in the market. So of the shares that is traded in the market, they're actually holding 50 to 45 to 50% of all the trading in the market is actually done by, all the float in the market is held by institutional investors. So that is why when institutions start selling or institutions start buying, the market is controlled by them. It is not traders like me and you who is trying to go and pick up the pieces in the market. It is them who actually dictate how the price should actually move. Yeah. Now you're talking about the FDI limits maybe, or the FII ownership limits. Yeah, but I think the last cap there is a limit of 25% if I'm not wrong. Okay, there is a limit. I think it's 25%, not more than that ownership. Okay, in large cap stocks. Now, one thing to notice, there is something called positive and negative feedback traders. What is positive feedback traders? Positive feedback traders are those traders who pick up securities when the prices are low and they sell the securities at a high. Now, what happens when these institutions sell the securities? There'll be herding. Everyone will start herding together. All the FIs will exit the market, Indian market. What will happen to the price? What will happen to liquidity? What will happen to liquidity? Who is providing them liquidity? How can they sell when there is no one else to buy? Do you get my question there? So the negative feedback traders typically buy when others are selling, okay, and sell when others are buying. Okay, and Indian market typically domestic institutional investors, if you look at the data, they do a contrarian strategy. Whenever FIIs sell, they buy, and whenever the FIIs buy, they sell. Okay, and that's how they do their trades to actually make a profit. Okay, so it is important to have positive and negative feedback traders in the market to ensure that the market liquidity doesn't go for a toss. Otherwise, you will have scenarios like liquidity black holes when everyone start probably going to sell the asset. Then there will be a sudden crash and sudden flash crashes that can happen in the market. Okay. There is also this concept of leveraging and deleveraging. The classic example is the global financial crisis, when the extreme leverage that happens when the firms start deleveraging. There'll be a sudden dearth in liquidity when that happens. Okay, essentially the business cycles in the market is what is captured by leveraging and deleveraging. The irrational exuberance, maybe you can construe today's market as that. A lot of experts have called for some correction in the market price today. There is an exuberance in the market and people are talking about some kind of correction that can happen in the market. The impact of regulation, the case of S-Bank is one example of liquidity black holes. Suddenly the price goes over through the roof, either upside or downside, because of certain regulatory changes. Okay, and hence there is an importance of diversity in a market to avoid such liquidity black holes is the concept. Okay, we stop with liquidity risk with this particular slide. Okay. The only thing that you should note here is the asset liquidity, the optimal unwinding of securities, and also this NSFR and LCR. As far as you're concerned, you're actually going into the job market. Please note that these are not really a trivial measure. These are things which are extremely material for banks and NBFCs today. So if you are going to one of these organizations, you will not miss these particular concepts that you learned. Okay, so we'll break now. We'll come back at 10:45, okay, and go through the rest of the concepts on economic capital and RAROC. And then I will break by 11:15 and I will discuss the 6 mistakes in risk management before we cap our sessions.
एक सेकंड।
In the final leg of our discussion, I would restrict it to three topics. Okay, probably I'll try to finish it by 11:05 or so, and then we'll go towards that note which I shared last day. So three topics which I think is relevant for most of you. One of them is probably determining the bonuses that is paid in banks today, some metric that is used.
वापस
And
मेरा सबका सेम ही है innovative push in the
yeah, so the first one is a concept called economic capital. Okay, economic capital. So far we have dealt with this concept of capital adequacy or capital that is required. We said capital is required for, as a buffer for any extreme shocks that the banks face, etc. And that is actually trying to capture the unexpected losses that the bank or the financial institution face. Now, there is this concept of economic capital. What do you mean by economic capital? Anyone? Anyone? Any idea what does economic capital mean? We had stumbled upon economic revenue, economic profit in that case on Wellfleet Bank. What would you gain, or rather, what would you think would economic capital mean? I'll just motivate it with the discussion rather than going through numbers, etc. Capital, you can either have economic capital or you can have regulatory capital. Anyone wants to take a shot at what the difference between these would be? Regulatory capital and economic capital. So I will just try to probably motivate this. Regulatory capital is essentially what the regulators tell you, RBI or the Basel regulations prescribe. That is a regulatory capital. So which means that if you have an asset of 100 rupees, okay, the regulators tell you that you have to set aside 10 rupees as capital, rest 90 can come from deposits. Okay. Now this is a regulatory capital. Now, what economic capital tells you is, look, you are the best judge of your own assets. Okay, based on your internal estimates, if this particular asset is probably rated triple B, and based on the triple B rating, you have taken 10 as the capital. Now, what economic capital says is, look, you know better about this particular asset. Maybe this particular asset is actually rated, say, double C or triple C. So in that sense, you should have actually ideally taken more than the regulatory capital. So economic capital is nothing but an internal estimate of the actual risk of that particular asset. Sometimes economic capital can be lower than regulatory capital, but the floor that is set by the regulators is, look, you have to maintain minimum of 10. Nothing doing, even if your estimate tells you it is 5, sorry, 10 is the minimum that you have to set aside. Okay, so internal estimate of capital is nothing but economic capital, and banks and financial institutions are now required to do something called as ICAP. Okay, it's essentially called the internal capital adequacy assessment procedure. Okay, this every bank does it, okay, since 2008 or 9 or so. It's called the ICAP procedure. Based on that, they set their economic capital requirements. Okay, that will help them allocate budget for the next year. Okay, how much of capital, because capital is the raw material as far as banks are concerned. If you don't have capital, you have to stop your business. Okay, as far as the financial institutions are concerned. So how do you allocate capital? How do you aggregate capital? How do you budget capital? All those are based on this concept called economic capital. That is nothing but an internal estimate of how much is the capital that you have to set aside as a risk buffer or as a shock absorber. Okay, and that is where this economic capital concept comes in. But I want to actually motivate the next concept more than this, and that is called RAROC. Okay, RAROC. This particular measure is used quite heavily in banks and financial institutions to ascertain the performance. So if you're going and entering a banking organization, then your team or even your appraisal would be based on this measure called RAROC. What is RAROC? It's called the risk adjusted return on capital. Okay, risk adjusted return on capital. Exactly. Okay, this is called the RAROC. You'll also encounter something called as EVA, or economic value added also being used in banks. That is nothing but absolute amount like your NPV. This is like your IRR, which you learned in corporate finance. Economic value added is like your NPV. It's a number. Okay, it's a number. This is like a IRR. This is a return that you get, risk adjusted return on capital. Okay, now we will try to motivate some numbers, some examples to take you through why that is important and how that is used. Okay, now you would see that, I'll try to motivate it using the slides there. So RAROC is simple. RAROC, the estimate of RAROC is straightforward. The total net revenues that the bank gets, so that is your net interest margin that you have. The total cost of operations, it's non-trivial for banks. Typically, cost of operations is quite high for banks. And then you subtract the expected losses, which is essentially the provisions that you're providing for, the expected losses in a portfolio. That could be the general provisions, that is like say 1% for the retail portfolio kind of, divided by the economic capital. Technically, economic capital is the risk-adjusted return on capital. But economic capital sometimes is tough to estimate because it's an internal estimates. You actually reduce this particular equation into this particular form. The numerator remains exactly the same. Revenues minus cost minus expected losses upon the regulatory capital that you have to set aside for a particular product. Now, this particular measure is used for ascertaining the performance of each divisions, sometimes each product, sometimes each department. It can be actually evaluated using RAROC. Now, you would be wondering, why can't we use a simple measure of ROE? Is ROE the same as RAROC? In banks, suddenly they have pivoted to using this measure called RAROC. Why can't they just use return on equity? Is it the same? Return on equity, is it the same? Equity would be the denominator, but that's what we are trying to say here. Regulatory capital also construes as equity, right? Tier 1 capital is essentially the equity itself. Sir, banks also use ROTCE. What is return on what? Total capital employed.
Tangible common equity.
Tangible common equity. Yeah, but this is actually now the tier 1 capital is more of the tangible common equity. You have the reserves. There are some that construes as tier 1 capital today. So this is most commonly used today. RAROC. But what you said is also same thing, tangible common equity. But even ROTCE, let's say Ravish is saying, sir, they use tangible common equity. Fair enough. But what's the difference between that and this? Then why are we using RAROC? Why are the banks moving towards this particular measure? At the bank level, both measures will be identical. Yes or no? At the bank level, both measures will be identical. Return on equity, return on tangible common equity is also at the bank level, right, Ravish? Yes or no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's based on what the balance sheet reporting is and the P&L is, right? That is where your denominator comes from the balance sheet and your return comes from the income statement. Now, the benefit of RAROC, it is exactly same as ROE. The benefit of RAROC is you can decompose it at the product level, at the individual level, or rather at the business unit level. Why? Because you can compute the capital that is employed by that particular product. You can decompose it, disaggregate it, and measure it. That's why RAROC is used. RAROC is exactly same as ROE. No difference. At the bank level, there is no difference. But at each individual product level, if I know what is the economic capital, what is the regulatory capital, if I am lending to Reliance, I have to set aside 2 rupees as capital. But if for 100 rupee exposure, if I am lending to say Idea, Vodafone Idea, I have to set aside 15 rupees as capital. So I can understand my regulatory capital requirement even at the product level, even at the unit level. In that sense, RAROC helps you decompose at a disaggregated level. That's the only difference. But this is the new way of ascertaining performance in banks and even for their bonuses or evaluation or product planning. Even product managers use RAROC to develop the pricing for the product. Okay, we'll see how. Let's take an example to understand how this is particularly employed. Let's take this example. Let's take this example. Can we do this, please? Can we do this, RAROC? It might help you, because this is also used in incentives, etc. So it just helps you if you're going into a financial institution. The investors in a bank expect a return of 15% on their capital. So whosoever has given you equity capital, they expect 15% return. The bank is planning to offer a product which invites 75% risk weight as per the regulatory norms. The expected losses from the product is 2.5% of the total assets. The total cost, including the funding cost and the administrative cost, is 5% of the assets. What should be the minimum pricing for this product, assuming that the capital adequacy requirement in the country of domicile is 9%? How will you price this product? Can someone help the class? I don't want to do it straight away in the Excel. I want someone who can motivate this to probably take the mic and start explaining how to do this. Who is going to take the mantle? Uh, 75 minus 5. Not really. Not really. Anyone wants to give a shot? Anyone wants to give a shot at what RAROC helps in ascertaining here? How do you price this product? Price has to be a percentage, right, Sesh? For each asset, how much you're going to charge? That's a question for this particular example. Okay, let's go to Excel. I don't think... okay, so what is given to you? Your hurdle rate, okay, or what the investors expect of your firm is 15%. Okay, the risk weight mandated by the regulators for the product that you're going to launch is 75%. Sorry. Okay. The expected losses is 2.5%. Okay. The total cost of funding and other SGA is 5%. Okay. What should be the minimum pricing? Is a question. The capital adequacy requirement of the country of domicile, like in India, is 9%. Okay, minimum capital adequacy is 9%. Now, what will you start off with? Let's start with the numerator. Okay, let's start with the numerator. So RAROC is what? RAROC essentially captures the risk-adjusted return on capital. The numerator of RAROC, okay, is revenue. The question is, what is the revenue? I don't know the revenue. Revenue minus cost minus expected losses. Okay, that is essentially my question mark minus 5% minus my expected losses, because these are provisions that I have to account for even when I'm pricing the particular product, because I told you the provisions typically come from the pricing. I'm expecting some people to anyway not give me back the money, and I know that ex ante, so I'm going to price it as a common pricing for everyone. Now my denominator is what? My denominator is the regulatory capital. What is the regulatory capital requirement for this particular product? Risk weight times the capital adequacy. Yes or no? Yes or no? Hello? Yes or no? Risk weight times the capital adequacy. The example that we took of Reliance AAA rated, okay, it was risk weight times the capital adequacy is the denominator, and this should be at least equal to, numerator by denominator should be at least equal to 15%. So what is my pricing? My pricing would be 15% times 7% plus 5 plus Is it okay? Is it okay to all of you? What we just did? 8.5% should be the price that you charge on this particular product to ensure that the equity holders are actually getting at least the hurdle rate that they're expecting from this particular product. Now, in order to price the product ex ante, you will use the RAROC measure to arrive at it. Okay, now you can say that, okay, 8.5 is the average pricing for this particular product. I can say some price band could be 8, some price band could be 9. On an average, I should have a 8.5 as my average pricing for this particular product. Is it clear to all of you? Any doubts here? Any doubts here? Oh, sorry, chat window is open. Oh, Vishwant 8.85. I'm really sorry. I forgot the chat window.
I forgot to take the risk weight in the denominator, sir.
Oh, you didn't take 75%. You just took 9% directly. Okay. So risk weight times the capital adequacy tells you the capital requirement, regulatory capital requirement. If it is 100% risk weight, then it is 9%. Now, let me ask you one question. There was this news that came out in July. Okay, the fact that RBI has delayed the implementation of capital conservation buffer. This was an additional buffer that is required by the banks to be by the banks to set aside by 2020. Now they delayed that particular rule because they were staggering it 0.625% every year or so. They were staggering it and they have delayed that. And because of that, because of the delay in the implementation of capital conservation buffer, banks have got about 56,000 crores in capital that is now that can be deployed elsewhere. Okay, what is the impact of that particular delay in the entire economy? 56,000 crore is the capital that is saved now. Okay, of course they have to set aside only later. They have delayed it. 56,000 crore is the savings in capital. Is there an implication in the economy because of this? If we have 56,000 crores in capital, what is the implication to the economy? The banks have 56,000 crores in capital. What is the implication to the economy? The loan ability is increased. You mean to say there is more resources now to lend, because as I told you, this is the fodder or the raw material for actually increasing your book size. Yeah. So with 56,000 crores, how much can you lend? If someone asks you a thumb rule, how much can you lend? How much can you lend? How much can you give outside? With 56,000 crores in capital, how much can Indian banks lend out? Roughly, if someone asks you that question, how will you approach that question? Approximately 10 times. Yeah, if 9% is the capital adequacy in India, then the leverage is that 1 divided by 9%, roughly that many number of times, assuming that we are talking about 100% risk weight. If you're actually having a lesser risk weight assets, say if you're lending to institutions like Infosys or ITC, etc., which is having very good credit rating, then you can actually even multiply the amount. So 56,000 crores in capital saved is akin to 5.6 lakh crore of lending that the banking system can actually lend outward to prop up the economy. So these kind of changes that you see in financial press has a lot of implications to the entire economy in terms of what we learned in this per se. Okay, so 56,000 crores can roughly translate into 10 times what you just mentioned. That is correct. Okay, so is RAROC clear? Can I move on? I will go towards the final concept called stress testing. Okay, now I have some slides talking what it is, but again it is subjective to the institution. There are some mandates by the regulators in terms of how the stress test should be conducted. But essentially you are looking for what if scenarios. Okay, what if scenarios are used to understand if such a stress event happens, will my bank be able to wade through that crisis? So typically all the regulators conduct stress tests on a periodic basis. Even the Reserve Bank of India conducted a stress test after the COVID fiasco. I mean, after the pandemic-induced disruption started, it was in July, if I remember correctly. They had also a commentary in their financial stability report. Anyone came across that particular article, news article? The Reserve Bank of India conducted a stress test, and there was a result of that. Did someone read about it? What percentage of the banking book is actually under moratorium? Any idea? What percentage of the Indian banking book was under moratorium when that report was, report came out? Moratorium means they have actually delayed the payments. They have not really defaulted. They have given a suspension of interest payments, during that period because of the pandemic crisis. Yeah. What percentage of the book was under moratorium? Any idea? What was it for HDFC? What was it for ICICI? Yeah, roughly half of the book was under moratorium, is what the report claims. Yeah, what was it for HDFC? What was it for ICICI? What was it for SBI? It's very important because I think HDFC had one of the least, banking book under moratorium, and you can see that in the performance of the stock also. That shows that the clientele that they're catering to are actually probably prime customers. Very less customers have actually taken moratorium. I think ICICI was very high two-digit. Between 20 and 50, if I remember correctly, ICICI, the percentage of their book under moratorium. Now, what RBI asked them to do is to stress it further and see whether you have enough capital to absorb the shock. Any idea what the result of the stress test was? The stress test result was, roughly 5 banks will not have adequate capital if those stress events actually materialize. That if the pandemic-induced disruptions prolongs for more period, and if they are not able to get a lot of payments, or rather, if a lot of customers default on their book, then up close to 5 banks, most of them public sector banks, will actually go under, in the sense that they won't have adequate capital to actually service that losses that you would incur because of COVID-induced disruption. Now, this became very prominent and prevalent after the GFC, that they started stress testing each of the bank, or each of the jurisdictions started testing based on certain criteria. Now, what are these criteria? The criteria could be suddenly there is a 20% loss of market valuation, market capitalization of Indian market, or suddenly the interest rates actually increases by 150 basis point. The benchmark rates had to be increased because of inflationary environment. If that happens, what will happen to your banking book? Will your customers be able to service your debt? Okay, if that doesn't happen, how much of loss will be incurred? If that is so, that is all what if kind of scenario analysis you try to do in a stress test, and based on that, you will ask banks to prepare. How do you ask banks to prepare? Either by asking them to shore up their capital, or you put them under PCA, prompt corrective action, which I think about 10 banks were put under PCA in 2017 under Veeralacharya. Okay, they did the test and said, look, these banks are actually poor performing, so they can't lend anything further. They go and set their operations correct. They're actually draining a lot of cash, make it much more efficient, try to reduce the losses, increase the collections, increase the credit recovery, so that you can actually come back to health, and then you can start lending further, because your lending has been bleeding. So try to put them in a ICU kind of space. Okay, and now there is something called, you have to also have a planned orderly liquidation plan. Okay, because as you saw in the case of Lehman, as a result of stress test, some banks will be required to give a orderly liquidation plan, how they are going to actually face the debt. If they're going to liquidate or file for bankruptcy, how will the assets be, which assets are prime, which can be sold later, which has to be immediately liquidated, similarly, and so on and so forth. This is the concept of stress testing and scenario analysis in banking. Typically, it is subjective and done by a committee of senior people who comes across and try to give expert scenarios based on their experiences. They will try to devise extreme stress scenarios to plan for such exigencies. So this is a what if kind of study. It is not based on numbers per se. It is more subjective. And of course, there are guidelines that has been mandated by both the regulators and the BIS to facilitate a good stress testing environment. And we saw in the case of Lehman, they also did stress tests, but they were fudging the stress test in the sense that they were keeping the commercial real estate exposure completely out of the equation when they were doing the stressing of the rest of the balance sheet. So these are ways in which, the last 3 topics, I don't want to take into more discussion here. With this, we will come to a conclusion of what we discussed in FRMM. Okay, to complete the course, I would urge you to discuss on that 6 mistakes on risk management. I'm a fan of Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Okay, his books. I thought, I should share that particular perspective with you. And some of you must have read that. So if someone can discuss each of the point, each point can be discussed by a different person. And let's try to, draw some, some kind of learnings from that. What does he say there? And some of them are actually profound because it's extremely valid, maybe not at the time when he wrote it, but maybe today. Okay. That's why that point 6 is extremely, extremely nice. Someone wants to start the first point that he mentioned, 6 mistakes. %31. Oh yeah, sorry, that is Vishwant. Anyone? Did you read it? Anyone? Yes. So if someone gives the initial, there's a starting trouble for everyone because everyone thinks that everyone else would take especially in a class where no one is seeing each other. So who wants to take the ownership for the first one? What is he trying to say? What are they trying to say? The 3 authors. It's an easy read, 7 pages. Very, very easy read and very nice read.
I'll take like the start and the first one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Sesh, let me ask also some people. Nehal, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Nehal, do you want to take the first point? I just want to, listen to people who have never spoken in the class.
Sir, the first point says that we can manage the risk by predicting extreme events, but these have very low probability. But the impact is very high.
No, mind you, his title is 6 mistakes. So he's not really telling you that we should do that. He's trying to say that we think we can manage this by predicting extreme events, right? So what is the learning from that? What is the learning from his write-up there? He's trying to correlate with the human behavior, right? That you're worried about consequences more. So try to do what if analysis, not really trying to estimate the probability of how things will unfold. Rather, plan for such an eventuality. What if consequences, and then plan for it. Do you have a plan in place when that actually strikes? Rather than trying to estimate the probability of that happening and trying to do a mathematical computation of it. Yeah, that is a learning from the first point. Nehal, is it correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. What about the second point? We are convinced that studying the past will help us manage the risk. I think that echoed in the class also. People were asking, sir, isn't there a look back bias? We are only looking at the past data. What is the problem there? What is his point? Someone else?
Can I take?
Who's that?
Utkarsh.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it tells about the black swan events. So it's like those are always unprecedented. So there is no past evidence for them how to prepare for it.
So what is his suggestion?
I think they are saying we cannot generalize every failure or every success. So there is no like typical failure or typical success.
A classic example is probably Indian team meeting in Australia, right? There is nothing like a typical failure or typical success anymore, right? These are things he's talking about, a non-linear kind of complex systems. It's extremely hard to predict today. If you think you can predict, then I think last 10 years is probably humbling, okay, in terms of what the world couldn't predict. Okay, so the way India won, I think it echoes that there is nothing like a typical success or a typical failure anymore. Okay, things have converged. It's extremely complex. People are different. It has to be a fresher perspective when we try to evaluate. I think that's what he's trying to say there. Okay, he's talking about socio-economic randomness. Okay, which is extremely hard to model. Okay, yeah, Utkarsh, anything else you want to add there?
No. That's
okay. The third one.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, I can take this.
Who is this? Samyak, go ahead.
Samyak. So, sir, is once again referring to some black swan events. He's mainly talking about the famous prospect theory, that we don't listen to advices that tell us to restrict ourselves, that don't do this, especially referring to banks in US banks, that if there is an advice given that this is, curb yourself or curb your actions,
Yeah. So
they
it is
don't do
about,
it.
Samyak, if I may come in, it's about also whistleblowers, right? People who try to
Yes,
say
yes.
that
Yes, yes,
you might have to slow down.
yes, and one also point he referred was that almost everyone, most people give positive advices and optimistic advices,
Correct.
and that's a charlatan's game. That's what he was mentioning
Yeah.
over
Yes.
there.
So he echoes that, and yeah, I mean, so that is something, always you want to listen to pleasant news. Sometimes failures is not really taught in the management science. It's only the wins and successes that people teach. So it's sometimes it's important to also listen to the naysayers, why they're saying so. You might have to probably give that kind of space to them. That's what he's trying to
Yes,
emphasize there. And he talks about a dollar not lost is a dollar earned. Is that he
yes,
says
yes,
that
yes,
is not really correct. He's saying it is asymmetric,
yes, yes,
right?
yes,
So think about
yes,
it in the market. Those who had market exposure, okay, today their wealth got wiped out by 40%. Now it is back up to the earlier levels. Okay, they are now net zero. Okay, but think about people who actually never had exposure to market but invested in the market on March last week. What about them? What about them?
yeah, they would have made a lot of
They
money
would have
out
made
of nothing.
exactly. So this also echoes what Warren Buffett says, right? You should be greedy when others are scared, and be scared when others are greedy. Yeah. So it's essentially a contrarian kind of notion that he is talking about here also. So sometimes you might be sitting on the fence for quite some time without taking adequate risk, but when things are really bad, you can actually go and pick up the pieces, even get some market share. Yeah. So when we say the objective that you learned in economics and in management is firms try to maximize their profits. In economics and in finance, we learned firms try to maximize their value. And if you're cutting corners to make it extremely efficient, then you might actually lose out in the long run, is what Taleb is trying to say. You should have a longer term perspective, is what that particular point is trying to say. Fourth one, Shubham.
Sir, I can.
Who wanted to take it? I'm sorry.
Sir, if no one is taking it, I can take it.
Ashwini, go ahead. Go ahead. No, because Shubham had asked me about the standard deviation. That's why I called his name. Ashwini, go ahead. It's okay.
So the 4 point says that we in finance we often use standard deviation a lot, like to gauge the volatility, and we end up using it up to till like 3 deviations and maybe beyond that. Like the point says
Six
up till like
Sigma,
7.
the process
Yeah.
improvements, yeah,
So,
everywhere,
but
right?
yeah, but in real life, the movements can exceed 10, 20, or 30 deviations. So we are not that capable of think that all the risk can be assumed and can be calculated by standard deviation.
Yeah.
And
So
even the experts are not quite know the
sure
concept.
about
And
uh, yeah, go ahead.
so this point basically caters to standard deviation and how it is not the entire solution of gauging the risk per se.
Yeah, I think the class also echoed that when we were doing it. So we have some limitations. I think that should be just kept in mind. I mean, that should be the main takeaway from this particular point. All you're saying is that the concept is not clearly understood. We also have mean absolute deviation, which can also capture deviations, which we argued in the class. But we said because of mathematical elegance, we tend to use standard deviation. But that is not a rational justification for using a measure and using that for all the kind of objectives that you want to meet. So that is his point. Have a perspective on what measures that you use, and we are using a single measure to judge risk. That is his point. That is saying that standard deviation is the go-to measure for measuring risk, and that should be kept taken with a pinch of salt, is what he is trying to say. What is the fifth point? Someone wants to take it? Fifth point. Someone wants to take it? Very hard, right? Engineers, people with a math background, I'm also tilted towards the quantitative side of things, but biases are there. That is what he's talking about. Anyone wants to take the fifth point? Fifth point. So depth of the order book of FRMM course is 4 people. Yeah, go ahead, Saurabh. I mean, please, your class, I mean, please go ahead. Saurabh? Saurabh? Am I audible? Is there a problem?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, fine. So someone wants to take it up. Saurabh's mic is having a problem. Fifth point. We don't appreciate that what's mathematically equivalent isn't psychologically so. Any example that you want to share? Saurabh, maybe you can just type it out if I may ask you to hear your perspective. I don't want to, just repeat whatever Talab said, but what did students understand by that statement?
Hello, sir.
Samyak.
I just want to chip in this one. That not exactly related to the article, but something separate. That the idea that we hate losses so much.
The loss aversion.
Because of that loss aversion, because of that, we tend to discount a lot for our losses than for our gains. That's so disproportionate. Mathematically, it isn't, but we discount losses way more than that. Therefore, sometimes bad events are disproportionately valued.
Correct. So, have you? I don't know if you have had a course on behavioral finance, Kahneman and Tversky, prospect theory, loss aversion, disposition. Have you had any course on behavioral finance?
No, sir, just read it.
Okay. So I think, this comes from the behavioral economics, Kahneman and Tversky and onwards. There are so many cognitive biases that is there within us, which I think people talk about in the class also, that while we perpetuate a lot of rational finance, when we motivate Capcom, etc., there is extreme irrationality that prevails in the market and prevails for quite some time. The example, maybe it's a mistake, is also these examples like Signal, right? I don't know, Signal firm recently, which Elon Musk endorsed for moving away from WhatsApp. What happened? Something behavioral happened with the Signal in the financial markets. Did you read some news around that?
Another stock named Signal went up.
Exactly. So another stock named Signal went up, in price, actually off the roof. So markets tend to behave irrational. I mean, even though despite there being brokers, there being people. So Utkarsh, think about it. It went up, right? Now, what happens in a rational market? What have we learned about rational market? There are arbitragers who will arbitrage it away, right?
Yes.
It's a free money, right, for the arbitragers? Yes or no?
Yes.
Then why did the price go up? Why did the price go up if that is so? Shouldn't arbitragers arbitrage it away? So there are more things that, what meets the eye. There is psychological biases. Of course, there is something called limits to arbitrage in that arbitrage literature. Okay. Typically, that price should not have gone up. Same thing in the case of, I think, Thomas Cook in India, when the parent company, or not the parent company, they didn't have much connect with each other. Similarly, there are so many instances where, these behavioral biases tend to persist in markets. So we should be appreciating the fact that, there is more to it than what meets the eye. There is cognitive biases that can persist in the market. And the final one, who wants to take it up? Final one. And I'm sure most of you were also taught the same thing. Is it so? What he's mentioning, is it the way you were taught? Do something bias. As in?
So basically, inaction is never rewarded. That is what everyone has always taught you. That if you don't perform, you have to do some action and only that will count as so. Even if it counts as failure, that's okay.
I gave this example, I think in mergers class maybe, or to the first years. this 5-star ad, right? Where the guy is standing and the Dadima is, the stick is fallen down or something, right? So he doesn't do anything. But it saved her, right? From actually the thing that is falling down. So that is also inaction. That is what Sesh is mentioning. Inaction is not an option today. Even in a case study in a class, you have to participate. You have no option but to speak up. So that is something. Inaction also can actually be an option as far as the entity is concerned or the individual is concerned. But more than that, can we deepen that analysis? Yeah, Ayushi, but think about the examples that he has given. Isn't it correct? Even my, guide used to tell me about these examples from human, from nature itself. Like, look at us itself, right? We have a lot of redundancy, right? In our body itself. Extremely telling examples. How nature has created. Nature is probably the most, efficient system because it has survived, most effective system rather. Okay. And it has survived, different tribulations and continues to be. So what is the learning from that? Ayushi, can you deepen that point? Rather than lying in jargons of efficiency, can we understand what that means? It has implications for labor. It has implications for, capital. It has implications for how you manage your day-to-day operations. Yeah. Like we discussed in one of the classes, lean operations tend to be profitable in the short term. Exactly. But the long-term value creation is not so much. Yeah, he's also echoing that, right? I mean, sometimes when things go bad, that's when you are actually probably saving a lot of money by actually maintaining some redundancy. So this is the concept of strategic redundancy. I think it's extremely telling in today's day because COVID actually gave or was an eye-opener for the world that, you should actually maintain a certain level of redundancy and not really efficient to the T. And that is actually, shaking up a lot of management, science as well. Okay, in terms of how we take these perspectives in the class. And this is 10 years back. He has actually, told this kind of notions. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else in that particular topic? He's talking about capitalism also, right? What is he talking about it? And these are very, very, I think, very, very powerful ones, which I like, because the way we learn and way we know about capitalism today is that, they participate in the upside, but capital is increasingly taking lesser risk. Leverage is not good all the time. That is fine that he talks about, but he talks about capitalism per se, right? Towards the end, one of the myths about capitalism is that it is about incentives. It's also about disincentives, right? He's talking about both the upside and downside. But think about Uber. I think I gave this example elsewhere. The way Uber is operating today, or Ola is operating today, or any other aggregator, who is taking the risk during the bad times? Who is taking the risk during the bad times? Who is owning the capital? Who is owning the capital? I don't know if my question is, yeah, the individual taxi owners, right? So think about it. Are they really participating in the upside? Who is actually participating in the upside? And who is participating in the downside? Is there an asymmetry there? So can we say that capitalism is actually not the conventional forms of capitalism? Capital is not really taking risk today. Capital is making riskless profit, so to say. It's like an option. Their downside is protected. They only participate in the upside. All the downside, they palm it off to the drivers and owners, individual taxi owners who are bringing in their capital to purchase the fixed asset. Do you think that is the case? Is there anything that you can echo there? All these aggregators. Do you think that is the case?
No, yes, sir. I mean, platform-based business models tend to do this, that they are kind of become a third party or a mediator, and becoming that mediator, makes them away from.
So what would Samyak? What is the consequence? And what would Samyak do to change this? Because these are all new models, right? Even now Australia is fighting a war with Google. I mean, we tend to think that everything is status quo, but it's not. People are now asking questions, right? So if tomorrow someone asks the question, and you are a consultant, and you're supposed to give a framework in terms of how will we change this kind of, accretion of upside to one party and downside to another party? What can be done? Sage, but that is not the conventional form of thing, right? We talk about residual claimant being the capitalist, but there is no residual claimant here is a taxi owner. You have been taught that way, right? In the first year, that we try to maximize shareholder value. The reason being that, shareholder is a residual claimant. After all the claimants are satisfied, only then they get the rest of the money. But is that true in today's models? Samyak, what will you do differently?
So, I mean, there can be only two things, in my opinion, can be done. Firstly, distribute the capital, make it as decentralized as possible.
That's
And
what the Uber has
secondly,
done.
yes. And the second thing, I guess the more effective one would be to cap the incentives, to make sure that the incentives are properly transferred. Uh, I mean,
To the drivers,
system.
to the
Yes, yes.
to the stakeholders also.
Bonuses. Yes, to bonuses,
Bonuses.
employees,
Okay.
giving them bonus.
Yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, is there anyone else? Someone wants to add to what Samyak mentioned to make it much more even? I mean, again, this goes to Thomas Piketty, notions about disparity. People, middle class, upper middle class, or lower middle class didn't really get affected by COVID. Of course, the rich didn't get affected, but it's the poor who get affected. So, is there anything that you want to tell in terms of the risk management perspective? Then you'll cap it after that. 11:30 already. Are models required? Does models help? That just talking things, implementation would work that way. Which one you're talking about, Sesh?
So, sir, I made a lot of grammatical errors there, but yeah. So I was saying that, the people in power would already have their own incentives designed in such a way that they remain in power. So in that sense, I mean, going purely from a capitalistic versus philosophy point of view, that is rarely possible because.
No, but why do you say that? Antitrust is already looking closely at the big FANG companies, right? They're trying to break them up and stuff. So, wouldn't regulatory,
the way that would work is again,
they will lobby.
That yeah, they'll lobby exactly. People in power will always make sure that they remain in power. So in that sense,
no, but
we
history,
can of course it can go on to a certain extent, but then I am highly doubtful that at least in my time period I will be able to see a equitable distribution of income as a
we are not talking about utopia, but at least some kind of change in the status quo, or we're just trying to think aloud here, not the conventional forms of what we learned. Things have to be a bit more different in the way the world is evolving. That's all we are trying to debate here. And I think you should keep that spirit as you go along the way, as you answer a question today, because I don't think there is a single answer, and you're going to go and face the real world in one more term. And I think, it's much more uncertain in the way things are. So it is always appreciated by the other party today that if you don't have a single answer, still it's fine. You should have a range. You should have a distribution if you want to put a quantitative spin to it. But try to have that spirit in mind. Don't go with a single minded approach. Try to keep it much more open and try to inculcate alternative viewpoints, etc., even in your organizations, because over and over again we are seeing much more these black swan events coming your way. So you're going to be future managers, risk managers in different ways. I mean, everyone is a risk manager in that sense, whichever organization you're going for. And I think you should keep that spirit. And I think that would be my final word of you can say advice, but the final word of final statement that I would make. And I think with that we'll break this course. Okay, it was a bit quantitative for some people, but you can't run away from objective ways of computing things today, because there is, unless you have a viable alternative, that continues to be the mainstream ways of understanding risk. Okay, so until and unless we have that, we should also appreciate the fact that objective ways of measuring risk is important to understand. Okay, so with that we will break, and all the best for your placements. Okay, rest, yeah, we will see, we'll catch up whenever. Some of you, I mean, I've never seen them. When I'm in the campus, if you meet me, just come over and talk to me and say that you are this person, you were in my class. I've not seen a lot of people in my class. Any which ways. So see you then. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Sir, could you
Thank you,
please
sir.
tell us something about the end term exam format or any?
Avik, it will be a mix of problems and multiple choice. It will be proctored. That is, I told you in the first class itself. I think MSCR.
Yes, sir.
I got a lot of things after the exam that would have been better if it was proctored. So I'll keep it proctored, but at the same time I'll keep it lesser load on you guys. I mean, just go through what we did in the class. I think more than enough. Okay, my quizzes and papers will be more or less that way. Maybe there could be some subjective questions from what we discussed. That's all. That's it.
Sure, sir. So, will it be closed book or will it be open book?
Open book. I typically keep open book. I don't like closed book. Open book, but proctor. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Sure. Bye.